The wolf wouldn't move. That was the first thing Captain Dex Aldric noticed when Engine 12 pulled onto Sutter Creek Road at 2:47 in the morning. The house at the end of the gravel lane was already burning from the inside out. Orange light pressing through every window, smoke rolling black and low across the frozen field. His crew was out of the truck before it stopped. Hoses unreeling, radios crackling, the whole practiced choreography of men who have done this before and know exactly what it will cost them if they slow down. But the wolf was standing in the doorway, not running, not howling, not doing what any animal in its right mind would do when fire was eating the walls 15 feet behind it. It was standing completely still in the frame of the front door, head low, eyes catching the light of the flames in a way that made Aldrich stop mid-stride. He had been a firefighter for 19 years. He had seen dogs refuse to leave burning houses. He had carried a cat out of a second-floor window with one hand while the floor sagged beneath him. He had once had to physically restrain a man from running back into a structure for a laptop. He had never seen a wolf, and he had never seen anything look at him the way this animal was looking at him now, with a stillness so complete it didn't read as fear. It read as something else, something that made one of his rookies say quietly from behind him that maybe they should call animal control first. Aldrich told him to get the line to the south side, but he didn't move toward the door. Not yet. What he didn't know, standing there in the heat and the smoke and the 2:47 darkness of a Montana November, was that the wolf had been in that doorway for 9 minutes before anyone arrived. 9 minutes of fire growing behind her, 9 minutes of smoke thickening in her lungs, 9 minutes of standing absolutely still in the one place that made no survival sense. What he didn't know was why. Captain Aldrich was not a man who made decisions slowly. 19 years on the line had compressed his decision-making into something close to instinct, a rapid triage of information that produced action faster than most people could form a complete sentence. He had run into structures he knew might collapse. He had pulled a man out of a vehicle that was leaking fuel while a downed power line was still sparking 12 feet away. He had made calls in the dark and in the smoke and in the heat that he could not always fully justify afterward, but had always been able to live with. He was standing still in the driveway of a burning house because of a wolf. That fact by itself was notable. He was standing still because there was something in the posture of the animal that was communicating information he could not dismiss. It was not the stillness of an animal, it was frozen by fear. Fear produced a specific physical signature, a body lowered and tucked, a gaze that flickered and skittered and looked for the exit. This was different. The wolf's head was low, but her gaze was direct, and her feet were planted, and her body was angled slightly inward, back toward the fire, in a way that said she was not trapped at the door. She was at the door because she had chosen to be there. One of his crew was asking him something. He held up a hand. He was trying to understand what he was being told. There are moments in emergencies that experienced responders describe in similar terms across different departments and different decades. Moments where the noise and urgency of a scene drops away for a second and something clarifies. Aldrich had had 3 or 4 of those moments in his career. He was having one now. The wolf was not blocking the door. She was in the door. There was a difference. He told his crew to work the perimeter, east and south sides, and to hold the front. He told Rios to get him the bolt cutters from the truck, which was not a thing he needed for any reason he could name, but which gave him 30 seconds to stand where he was and watch the animal. She watched him back. The fire was louder now, the east wall starting to open up, and the smoke had thickened enough that the wolf was occasionally obscured, a gray shape in a gray cloud, visible and then not. But she did not move, not back, not forward. Rios came back with the bolt cutters. She stood next to him and watched the wolf. Rios was 26. She had been on Engine 12 for 14 months. She had a daughter 9 months old, which meant she had been 8 months pregnant when she finished her probationary period, which had produced a brief period of administrative uncertainty that she had resolved by showing up every shift and doing the work. Aldric considered her one of the better instincts he had made as captain. He said quietly, "What do you think?" She was quiet for a moment. She said she thought the animal was trying to tell them something. He said he thought so too. He said, "We go in from the east breach, and we do not approach the front door directly, and we give her room to move. You stay behind me and you watch her feet." She said she understood. He keyed his radio and told the crew on the south line to hold, and that he and Rios were going in through the east breach and to be ready. The east wall had a gap at the base from where the fire had consumed the sill framing, wide enough for a person to pass through at a crouch. Aldric went first. The inside of the structure was heavy with smoke and heat, and he pulled his mask and visor down and let his eyes adjust. The floor was gone in the center of the main room. The fire was concentrated in the ceiling and the west-facing walls. The northeast corner was still intact, structurally, because it was the furthest from the origin point, and because the stone foundation there was solid enough to have slowed the spread. He could hear the wolf, not barking, not snarling. A sound he did not have a word for, low and continuous, coming from the northeast corner. He moved toward it. The floor held. He moved carefully, testing each step, the way you do in a structure where you cannot see what is underneath you, where the difference between sound and unsound is the difference between continuing and falling. Rios was close behind him, one hand on his shoulder as a contact point. The sound got louder. He reached the northeast corner and crouched and looked at the floor and saw the gap. It was not obvious. It was the gap between two floorboards where the original carpentry had left a seam, wide enough that something could have pushed it wider over time, wide enough now to see into the space below. He got his light on it. He saw fur. He looked up. The wolf was 3 feet away from him. She had come in from the front door while he was moving through the east breach. She had followed him to this corner. She was standing with her nose pointed at the gap in the floor, and she was making that sound, and she was looking at him. Aldric said quietly, "I see it." He said it to the animal. He was aware, saying it, that this was not standard incident command communication. He said it anyway. He told Rios to get him the pry bar from his kit. It took 9 minutes to get to the cubs. The floorboards were old-growth pine, solid and resistant, and the space below was a crawl space that had been converted, in the way that animals convert things, into a den, lined with leaves and grass and a piece of material that turned out to be a horse blanket from the barn. The cubs were in the back corner of the den, in a cluster alive. He got the first one out and handed it to Rios. The wolf made a sound that Aldric, who was not a sentimental man, described later to the FWP officer as the most complicated sound he had ever heard from an animal. He said he did not know how else to describe it. He said it was not relief, because he did not think animals felt relief in the way he understood the word. He said it was something that had the shape of relief, the frequency of it, the release. He got the second cub out. He got the third. He told Rios to move for the east breach, and she moved. The wolf did not follow them out. This was the part that stayed with Aldric afterward, that he would return to in the way you return to things that do not fully resolve. The wolf had been in that house for the entire time they were working, had followed him to the corner, had waited while he retrieved the cubs. And then, when the cubs were out and Rios was moving for the breach, the wolf had turned and walked back toward the front of the house. He had assumed she would follow them out the breach. She had not. He had made it out himself and turned and waited. She came out the front door. He had not understood why that mattered to her. He did not understand it now. He had described it to the FWP officer and the officer had written it down and had not offered an explanation. The wolf was sedated 8 minutes later. Aldric stood in the yard with the 3 cubs in a crate that one of his crew had improvised from a storage bin and a section of welded wire mesh, and he looked at the burning house, and he thought about the particular stubbornness of things that refused to leave. He thought he understood something about it. He was not entirely sure what. There are things about fire that people who have not been inside a burning structure do not understand. One of them's the sound. Fire is not silent. It is one of the loudest things a person can stand near. A combination of cracking and roaring, and the specific percussive sound of materials failing, of wood joints giving way, of glass contracting and then shattering, of air being pulled through gaps by the thermal column rising above the structure. It is loud enough that, standing inside, the crew communicated in shortened phrases and gestures and the practiced shorthand of people who have learned to understand each other through noise. The wolf had been inside that noise for 9 minutes before the trucks arrived. This is worth sitting with. 9 minutes of that sound, of that heat, of smoke, dense enough to obscure the walls, of a floor that was beginning to flex in ways that solid floors should not flex. 9 minutes in which every biological signal she possessed was issuing the same instruction, which was the oldest instruction in the sequence of animal survival, which was to leave. She had not left. There is a specific quality of attention that wildlife researchers describe in animals under extreme stress, a narrowing of focus to a single object or location, the way a mother elephant returns to a calf that cannot rise, the way a dog circles back to a trapped companion. It is not human courage. It does not require the concept of sacrifice or the weighing of outcomes. It is something older and more absolute, a behavioral state in which the normal hierarchy of priorities has been suspended and replaced by a single point of gravity that everything else orbits. The cubs were that point. She had gone into the fire to reach them, and had found them, and had understood, in whatever way she was capable of understanding, that she could not carry 3 of them and survive. A gray wolf can carry prey in its mouth while running. She could not carry 3 cubs through a burning house and a smoke-filled doorway and survive. And something in her assessment of the situation had reached that conclusion and arrived at the alternative. She would wait at the door. She would wait at the door until something changed. Something had changed when the headlights of Engine 12 came up the gravel lane. She had not known what a fire truck was. She had not known what the men who got out of it were, or what they intended. What she had known was that they were large and organized and moving toward the house with equipment, and that this was different from the stillness that had preceded them, and that different meant possible. She had stayed in the door. She had waited. And what no one would understand, not until almost an hour later, when the fire was out and the dawn was starting to gray the sky over the Burtooth foothills, was that the wolf had been making a decision, not an instinct, not a reflex, a decision. The house belonged to a woman named Maren Voss. She was 51 years old, lived alone on 40 acres that she had bought with the settlement from a marriage that had ended in ways she preferred not to describe to people she had just met. She kept 3 horses, a garden that was mostly dead by October, and a wood shop in the old barn where she made furniture that she sold to a store in Billings. She had come to this property 8 years ago with 2 suitcases and a Dutch oven and the specific intention of being left alone, and Montana had been, in her experience, very good at honoring that intention. She was not home when the fire started. She was 40 minutes away, sitting in the parking lot of St. Vincent Healthcare in Billings, because her friend Carol had called at midnight with chest pain that turned out to be anxiety. And Maren had driven out in the dark because Carol had no one else to call. And Maren was someone who showed up when she was needed, even when she was tired, even when it was midnight, even when her own life had taught her repeatedly that showing up did not always mean things turned out well. Her phone rang at 2:52. She didn't recognize the number. She answered anyway. The voice on the other end identified itself as the Stillwater County Sheriff's Office and told her that her property on Sutter Creek Road was on fire and asked her please to come to the scene as quickly as she safely could and to let them know if there was anyone who might have been inside. Marin said no. She said she lived alone. She said it the way people say things when they are still processing, when the words are coming out, but the meaning hasn't caught up yet. Then she put the phone against her chest and sat very still in the hospital parking lot and tried to understand what had just happened to the life she had built. She thought about the horses the way you think about things that are fine, that you know are fine, that you remind yourself are fine in the specific way that means you need to keep reminding. Roscoe and the gray mare she called Fleet. They would be in the paddock. The paddock was not near the house. The paddock was the farthest point from the house, near the old cottonwood windbreak, and she had checked the gate latch just 2 days ago because it had been sticking in the cold. She made herself stop going through inventory. She made herself breathe. The car heater was running too hot, and she turned it down and cracked the window, and the November air came in sharp and sagebrush cold, and it helped, the way cold air always helps, by returning you to the present tense. She had lived in the present tense for 8 years. That had been a choice made deliberately, because the past tense had been a place she could not afford to stay in. The life before Sutter Creek Road had been one version of herself, and that version had been capable and organized and had known exactly where she was going. And then one morning she had understood that the place she was going was wrong in a way she could not explain to anyone, including herself, without sounding like a woman who had made a series of entirely rational decisions and was blaming the math instead of the equation. She had not blamed the math. She had left. She had bought the property on Sutter Creek Road with the settlement and a stubbornness that several people in her life had characterized as concerning. And she had been fine with that characterization because stubbornness and independence looked identical from the outside and only felt different from the inside, and she was the only one inside. 8 years, the wood shop, the horses. Carol, who lived 40 minutes away and called at midnight with chest pain that turned out to be anxiety. The garden, which grew tomatoes and kale, and an unreliable pepper that she planted every year anyway, out of something that was not quite optimism, but lived in the same neighborhood. All of it was in that house. She turned onto the highway and pushed the speed up to 80. She did not think about the horses again after that, because she knew they were in the paddock and not the barn. She thought, in the strange, clear way that shock produces, about a specific evening 3 weeks ago when she had stood at her kitchen window, watching the tree line at the edge of her property, and felt certain, for the first time in years, that she was being watched. She had told herself it was a deer. She had told herself a lot of things. It took her 38 minutes to drive back to Sutter Creek Road. By the time she turned onto the gravel lane and saw the trucks and the lights and the smoke rising gray, now instead of black, she was something beyond calm. She was in the particular state that comes after you have already cried in the car and arrived at the place where crying doesn't change anything. The smoke was the first thing she smelled when she turned onto the gravel lane, long before she could see the trucks. It was a particular smell, wood smoke, but heavier, chemical, with an edge underneath it that she would not be able to name for several days, until a firefighter described accelerant to her, and she recognized it from the back of her memory. Her headlights came up over the small rise, and the whole scene came into view, and she stopped the car, not at the perimeter tape, before it. She stopped in the middle of the lane and sat there for a moment looking at the trucks and the lights and the shape of the structure, which was no longer really a structure, which was more like the idea of a structure, the outline of it, the framework that fire leaves when it has taken everything worth having. One wall was still standing, the east wall. She did not know why that mattered to her, but it did, the way specific and arbitrary details matter when your mind is refusing the larger picture and grabbing on to whatever it can hold. There was a deputy at the perimeter tape. He came to her car window, and she rolled it down, and he asked if she was the owner, and she said yes, and he asked her to pull to the shoulder and come with him. She pulled to the shoulder. She came with him, and she saw the wolf. The wolf was in the back of a large SUV with FWP markings on the door, in a transport crate visible through the vehicle's rear window. She was lying down with her head on her paws, which was a posture of such complete exhaustion that Marin stopped walking for a moment without intending to. The animal's eyes were open. She was looking at something that was not visible from where Marin stood. The deputy said the FWP officer was just finishing up the intake paperwork. Marin said, "Who called them?" He said the crew had, when they found the animal inside, standard protocol. She said, "Was she hurt?" He looked at her for a moment, deciding whether this was a question that mattered right now, and then said no, they believed she was uninjured. Stressed, but uninjured. Marin stood there another moment. The wolf had not moved. Then she followed the deputy to the tarp. The deputy who met her at the perimeter tape had a face that was practiced at delivering information without emotion. He told her the structure was a total loss. He told her the crew had it contained. He told her there had been an animal at the scene, a wolf, which had complicated initial entry. Marin looked at him. She said, "What wolf?" He said, "A gray wolf female, they believed." He said she had been standing in the doorway when the crew arrived and had refused to move, and that it had taken nearly 8 minutes of the crew working the perimeter before she had retreated, not out the front door, but back into the house. Marin said she went back in. The deputy said yes. They had been concerned. But by then the crew had a line on the main fire and had been able to breach the east wall, and what they found inside had, he paused here, had changed the nature of the situation somewhat. He said she should come with him, past 2 firefighters who were still working the smoldering edges, past a cluster of sheriff's vehicles, to a section of the yard where someone had set up a portable work light and laid out a tarp on the frozen ground. On the tarp, wrapped in a firefighter's jacket, were 3 wolf cubs. They were small enough to hold in 2 hands. They were the gray-brown color of river stones. 2 of them were making small, continuous sounds, a kind of muffled vibration that was not quite a whimper. The third was still. Marin stood at the edge of the tarp and did not speak. She crouched down. She was not sure why she crouched. She was not going to touch them, and she knew she should not touch them. And the FWP officer who was standing nearby had not told her not to, but had positioned herself in a way that communicated it without requiring words. But she crouched anyway, because it felt wrong to look at them from standing height, because the distance felt like a kind of refusal, and she was done with refusal. They were small enough that she could not entirely believe they had been in that house, that they had been warm and breathing in the northeast corner while the walls burned, while the floor failed, while the smoke filled every space that air had occupied. Small enough that the firefighter's jacket wrapped around 2 of them at once, the third tucked alongside. The one that had been still was moving now, that slow rolling testing motion, the way newborn things test the world, with no understanding of consequence. She watched it for a long time. She was thinking about something she had not thought about in years. A conversation she had with a wildlife biologist at a county meeting several years earlier, a woman who had been presenting on Wolf Recodify in the Birdtooth corridor. The biologist had said something that Marin had written down that evening, and then forgotten, or not forgotten exactly, but filed into that category of things you register as true and do not know what to do with yet. She had said that wolves were one of the few predators that would make choices in the presence of fire that appeared to prioritize something other than their own survival. that the bonding instinct in mothers, in particular, produced behaviors that had no good explanation from a purely survival standpoint. That researchers had documented cases where wolves had returned to burning structures, had stayed near dying pack members, had done things that, if a human had done them, would have been called courage without anyone questioning the word. The biologist had been careful to say she was not calling it courage. She had said she did not know what else to call it. The smallest cub made a sound, brief and incomplete, like the beginning of an intention rather than the intention itself. Marin put her hands on her knees and stood up. The deputy told her the cubs had been found in the northeast corner of the structure, in a space under the floorboards, in what appeared to be a den. He said the wolf had led one of the firefighters to that corner, that she had been circling that spot when they found her inside, and that the firefighter, a young woman named Taya Rios, had understood what the animal was showing her. He said the wolf was currently in the back of a wildlife recovery vehicle. He said they had called Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. He said everyone was safe, but he was watching Marin as he said this in a way that suggested he was not sure safe was the right word. Because the fire, he said carefully, was not an accident. Marin looked up from the cubs. He told her that the preliminary finding from the fire investigator was accelerant. Specifically, a liquid accelerant applied in a pattern on the exterior of the structure near the back foundation. He told her that the origin point was inconsistent with electrical failure, with a chimney issue, with any of the things that accidental fires tend to look like. He told her that they would need to ask her some questions, and he was sorry for the circumstances, and he was sorry about her house. And then he asked her if she could think of anyone who might want to do this. Marin did not answer right away. She was looking at the cubs on the tarp. The two that had been making sounds had gone quiet. The one that had been still was now moving, a slow rolling motion, testing its own limbs. She thought about the feelings she had had 3 weeks ago at her kitchen window. She thought about the night 2 months before that, when she had found tire tracks in the mud at the far edge of her property, near the old water line, in a place where there was no reason for anyone to drive. She had taken a photograph with her phone and then not done anything with it because she had not been able to think of who to call or what to say that wouldn't make her sound like a woman who was afraid of things she couldn't prove. She thought about a man named Cutler Briggs. And the part of the story that nobody talked about started there. Cutler Briggs was not from Stillwater County. He was from it in the sense that he had grown up there, graduated from Columbus High School in 1988, spent 6 years working the drilling sites out past Absaroki. But he had left. He had left the way people leave when a place has stopped fitting them, or when they have done something that makes staying feel complicated, and he had not been back, to Marin's knowledge, in almost 4 years. She had known him for 11 years. She had been afraid of him for 8. This requires context that Marin herself had needed years to assemble, because the thing about Cutler Briggs was that he was not the kind of man who was obviously dangerous. He was medium height, medium build, a face that was plain in the way that made it hard to remember after you looked away. He did not raise his voice. He did not break things. He paid his bills and showed up when he said he would, and gave money to the volunteer fire department every Christmas, which in retrospect was a detail that seemed almost too deliberate. What Cutler Briggs did was quieter than that. He watched. He waited. He collected information about people and the patient, unhurried way of someone who understood that knowledge was a kind of leverage. He knew whose marriages were troubled, whose finances were thin. He knew whose marriages were thin, who had problems with alcohol or prescription medication or the particular loneliness that rural Montana produces, in people who came here expecting something different than what they found. He had never used any of it directly, as far as Marin could determine. He had used it to be the person people came to when they needed something they couldn't get anywhere else. Alone with no paperwork, a favor that left no trace, an arrangement that was, on the surface, generosity, and underneath it, something that accrued interest in ways that were never stated out loud. She had understood this about him slowly, the way you understand things that require you to revise a previous version of yourself that you preferred. The version of herself that had talked to him for 20 minutes at the auction and found him interesting was a version that trusted her instincts about people, and she had been proud of that version, and letting go of it required admitting that she had been wrong about something she had believed herself good at. The calls had been, at first, genuinely pleasant. He was informed about the property market, useful about county regulations, funny in the dry, underplayed way of men who grew up where humor was a form of stoicism. She had found herself looking forward to hearing from him. That had been the point, she understood later. The pleasantness was not a mask on something uglier. It was real. He was genuinely good company. The leverage was also real. They coexisted. The first time she felt the shift was 11 months into knowing him. She had been negotiating to buy a parcel near Absariki, a small property with a creek access that she had thought about for years. And the negotiation had stalled, and she had vented about it to Briggs in one of their conversations. And 2 weeks later, the seller had agreed to terms that were considerably more favorable than anything she had been offered before. She had not known whether to be grateful or afraid. She had been grateful. That was the beginning of something she would spend years understanding. Not money. He never asked for money. Not anything explicit. It was more like the creation of an atmosphere, a sense of mutual knowledge, of being seen and of seeing, that accumulated over time into something she could not name but could feel. The way you can feel a change in air pressure before a storm that has not arrived yet. She had begun pulling back from him 14 months before she bought the Sutter Creek Road property. The calls became less frequent, then sparse, then stopped. He had not objected. He had said, in the last conversation they had, that he hoped she was doing well. His voice had been warm and genuine. She had known it was not over. Some things you know in the place before language. You know them in the body, in the specific way your shoulders behave when you hear a certain sound, or the way your eyes move to a window without your brain sending the instruction. You know them from the animal part of yourself, which is older and less patient with rationalization than the part that forms sentences. She had bought the Sutter Creek Road property partly because it was good land at a fair price, and partly because it was the kind of place a person could disappear into if they were careful about their digital footprint, which she had been. She had never told anyone the address in a context where she did not already trust them completely. She had not updated her driver's license for 2 years after moving. She had been careful. She had still known it was not over. Marin had met him at a property auction 7 years before she bought her own place, when she was still married and still living in Billings, and still believing that her life was going in the direction she had pointed it. He had been standing near the back of the room. He had said something that was genuinely funny. They had talked for 20 minutes, and she had gone home thinking he was interesting in the way that pleasant strangers could be interesting, which is to say, she had not thought about him again. He had thought about her. She didn't understand this for a long time. The calls started 6 months after her marriage ended, which meant he had been paying attention to her life from a distance for years without her knowledge. She had told herself at first that this was coincidence. She had told herself that she was being dramatic, that she was in a vulnerable state and misreading ordinary friendliness as something with an edge to it. Then he had said something, one evening very quietly, about a property she was considering buying. A property he had no way of knowing she was looking at unless he had been in contact with a real estate agent, or had accessed county records, or had talked to someone in her circle of acquaintance in ways she had never been told about. He had said it like it was nothing, like he was just making conversation. And she had understood, fully and without drama, that there was something in his possession that was worse than anger. She had come to Sutter Creek Road partly to disappear. Not from her life, but from the particular attention of a man who had decided, for reasons she never entirely understood, that she was worth keeping track of. She had not heard from him in 4 years. She had not been entirely sure that was over. 12 days before the fire, she had found a mark on the back gate of her property that she had not been able to explain. It was not a mark that suggested vandalism or carelessness. It was a small thing, scored into the wood with something narrow and precise, in a spot low enough that you would not see it unless you were looking. She had stared at it for a long time in the cold afternoon light, and then closed the gate and gone inside and locked the door. She had not told anyone, because telling someone would have required explaining, and explaining would have required her to describe a situation that, when laid out in language, sounded like something that could be managed with a restraining order and a change of phone number, and Marin had lived long enough to understand that some situations did not respond to formal instruments. She was not a woman given to magical thinking. She had not connected the mark on the gate to the feeling of being watched through her kitchen window to the tire tracks near the water line into any coherent theory, because she had not wanted to. She had wanted it to be nothing. She had wanted to be a woman who was left alone on 40 acres in Montana, making furniture, keeping horses, earning her own peace. Now she was standing in her burned yard at 3:40 in the morning, and the deputy was watching her, and on the tarp in front of her 3 wolf cubs were breathing. She told him about Cutler Briggs. She told him about the mark on the gate. She told him about the tire tracks, and she told him she had a photograph on her phone, and she could see from his expression that he was refiling this conversation into a different category than the one it had started in. Marin sat down on a folding chair that someone had set out and nobody had told her about, because it was just there, in the way that people leave chairs at scenes without anyone instructing them to, as an acknowledgement that standing is not always possible. She sat and she looked at the burned foundation of her house, and she let herself be afraid for approximately 2 minutes, which was about how long she ever allowed it. Then she got out her phone and found the photograph of the tire tracks. She had taken it on a morning in September when the mud near the old water line had been soft from 2 days of rain, and the tracks were deep enough to give a clear impression of the tire tread. She had not been sure what she was photographing or why. She had taken it the way you take photographs of things that trouble you when you do not yet have a category for your trouble. She handed the phone to the deputy. He looked at it for a long time. He took out his own phone and photographed her screen. He said the date metadata would be important. He said they would need the original file. She said she would send it to him. He gave her his card, and she looked at the card, which said Deputy Marsh Cantrell, Stillwater County Sheriff's Office, and it struck her that she had been living on Sutter Creek Road for 8 years and had never needed to know the name of a deputy, and that this was both something to be grateful for and something that was now quite definitively over. He went to make calls. She sat in the chair. The fire investigator, whose name she did not catch because it was 4 in the morning and her brain was in the stage of exhaustion where new information stopped adhering properly, came to speak with her briefly. He had a clipboard and a voice that was so steady and uninflected that she could not tell if he was exhausted or always like this. He asked her about the chimney, the last time it had been swept, whether she used it regularly. He asked about the wood shop and whether she stored accelerants there. He asked about the electrical panel and when it had last been inspected. She answered each question. Then he said, and this is a standard question we ask in all cases, is there anyone who might have wanted to damage the property? She had not answered him immediately. She had looked at the east wall still standing, at the trucks, at the FWP vehicle, where the wolf was lying with her head on her paws, looking at something Marin could not see. She said there might be someone. He wrote something on his clipboard. He said he would be in touch. He went back to the foundation. He made a call. He was on the phone for 4 minutes. When he came back to her, he was not the same deputy he'd been before the call, and she noticed this. He said they were going to need a full statement. He said the fire investigator had found something at the origin point, a partial boot print in the mud at the back foundation, preserved under the area where the accelerant had been applied. He said they had the capacity to run that, given the right comparative sample, and that if she could provide any additional information about the individual she had mentioned, that would be very useful. He did not say the name Cutler Briggs out loud again, but he was looking at her in the way people look when a story that seemed random has started to take a shape they recognize. What Marin did not know, because she had no way of knowing it, was that Cutler Briggs had driven to Sutter Creek Road that night with a specific purpose that went beyond her house. The Beartooth Land Corridor Initiative was not publicly named. It existed in a series of LLCs, each holding a single parcel, each incorporated in a different state, each connected to the others only through a financial architecture that required 3 forensic accountants and 11 weeks to map. The goal, as the investigators ultimately described it, was the creation of a continuous private landmass running roughly 22 miles along the northern face of the Beartooth, a stretch of terrain that included a year-round creek, 2 high-altitude meadow systems, an elk migration corridor that outfitters had been paying significant access fees to reach for decades, and a viewshed that a Montana-based resort developer had valued in a prospectus that investigators also eventually found at somewhere between $40 and $70 million, depending on permitting outcomes. Marin's 40 acres was the last piece. Every other parcel in the assembly had been acquired, some through willing sellers, some through sellers who had been willing after certain pressures, none of which were documented, and most of which the investigation could not prove. Marin was the holdout, not because she had understood the full picture, but because she had understood enough. She had known, when the first broker approached her, that the offer was structured in a way that obscured who was buying. She had known that this was done deliberately. She had declined without asking why, because asking why would have required her to engage with a process she did not trust, and she had learned to trust her distrust of processes she could not see. Stellan Holt had underestimated her. This was, his attorneys would later argue somewhat desperately, not entirely his fault, because nothing in his assessment of the situation had flagged her as an obstacle of that particular kind. She was a woman alone on 40 acres. She made furniture. She had no attorney on retainer, no adjacent political connections, no visible reason to hold out against an offer that was, by any reasonable market analysis, generous. What he had not accounted for was that she was not holding out against the offer. She was holding out against the feeling, and the feeling had been right. This requires going back 4 months to a conversation that took place in a bar in Red Lodge between Briggs and a man named Stellan Holt, who worked for a land development company out of Billings that had been quietly acquiring property in the Beartooth corridor for the past 3 years. Holt had been in contact with Briggs because Briggs was the kind of man that companies like Holt's found useful, a person who knew the county, knew the properties, knew which owners were motivated to sell and which ones needed additional motivation. Marin's 40 acres sat between 2 parcels that the company already controlled. Without her land, the corridor was incomplete. With it, the whole assembly had a value that was approximately 11 times greater than the sum of its parts. Holt had made Marin an offer through a broker 8 months ago. She had declined without reading it in full. She had declined a second approach 6 months ago. A third approach through a different broker had not even received a response. Briggs had been contracted in a way that was deniable enough to satisfy everyone involved, to change the calculus. The fire was supposed to be clean. The house was supposed to be unoccupied. The accelerant pattern was designed to make it look like a chimney failure. He had checked the property twice. He had not seen the wolf. He had not seen the den under the floorboards. He had not seen 3 cubs that a wolf had been nursing in the northeast corner of a house she had found warm and sheltered and safe. The way animals find such things, without asking permission, without understanding property lines, without any awareness that the structure around them was owned by a human being who was not home and might not be home, and who was 40 miles away in a hospital parking lot when the fire started at 2:37 in the morning. The wolf had come home from hunting at 2:41. She had smelled the accelerant before she reached the property line. This is not speculation. A gray wolf's olfactory capacity is roughly 100 times greater than a human's, and the chemical signature of certain petroleum-based accelerants is, to a wolf's nose, something close to overwhelming. A smell that has no natural analog in the environment, that registers in the brain as wrong in a way that has no prior entry in the animal's experience. She had found the fire already consuming the east side of the structure. She had gone in through the front door. She had spent 3 minutes with her cubs, had moved each of them, had attempted to understand whether she could carry them and survive, had determined she could not, had made the decision that was not an instinct but a decision, and had gone to the door and stood in it. This is the part that Taya Rios, the firefighter who found the cubs, would describe in interviews later as the part she kept returning to. Not the wolf in the doorway, not the fire behind her. The fact that when Rios finally got inside, the wolf did not run. She moved in a straight line from the door to the corner where the cubs were. She moved deliberately. And she stopped there and looked at Rios. Rios had a daughter who was 9 months old. She said later that this was probably why she understood immediately. She said she wasn't sure that was the whole explanation. The cubs were extracted in 11 minutes. The wolf was sedated by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks at 4:15, transported to a wildlife rehabilitation facility outside of Livingston, and examined. She was healthy. She was approximately 4 years old, which was old enough to have been alive the winter 3 years ago when 2 wolves from a pack in the Beartooth had been captured by a trapper working without a valid license, and one had been killed, and one had been released after a Fish, Wildlife and Parks investigation that had resulted in a citation and a fine that everyone involved considered to be inadequate. The surviving wolf had not been seen in that area since. The examiner in Livingston found a scar on her left foreleg. It was old, almost surgical in its precision. It ran along the bone in a way that was consistent with a cable trap. She had been the one who was released. Marin learned this 2 days after the fire from a FWP officer named Oris K. Steele, who came to the motel in Columbus where Marin was staying and sat with her for 2 hours going through documents and photographs. K. Steele said they could not prove it was the same animal. She said the scar was consistent, the size was consistent, the geographic range was possible. She said she was telling Marin because she thought Marin would want to know, and also because the trapper who had been sighted 3 years ago was a man who had worked the eastern edge of the Beartooth, and his name was in the county records, and his name was Cutler Briggs. K. Steele pulled out a folder. Inside was a photograph taken at the rehabilitation facility of the wolf's left foreleg. The scar was photographed from 2 angles and at 2 distances, and even in the photograph, it was possible to see what the examiner had described, the long, clean line of it along the bone, the specific quality of a wound that had healed without proper treatment and had calcified into something permanent. K. Steele said the trapping incident 3 years ago had involved 2 wolves from a pack that had been ranging into the eastern Beartooth corridor, which was at the edge of their established territory. The trapper had used cable traps on what he had claimed was private land. 1 wolf had died before FWP arrived. The other had been alive but badly injured, the cable having tightened around the foreleg when the animal had struggled, and the question at the time had been whether the leg could be saved, and the answer had been yes, barely, with intervention and rest and time. The wolf had been released 8 months after the incident, back into the corridor. She had not been seen again in that area, which was not unusual. Wolves that had been handled, that had been through trauma, sometimes shifted their range significantly. The GPS collar had been removed as part of the release protocol, which was standard, but which meant there was no continuous data after that point. The trapper's citation had resulted in a fine of $1,200 and a license suspension of 18 months. Casdell said she had never agreed with that outcome. She said it quietly, not as a statement for the record, not as something official, just as a fact she was offering to Marin the way you offer certain facts to people who have a right to them. Marin said, $1,200. Casdell said yes. Marin was quiet for a moment. Outside the motel window, the light was doing something specific with the late November clouds, a particular flatness that was the precursor to the first real snow. She had always liked that light. She had liked it for 8 years from the window of a house that no longer existed. She asked if the wolf would be all right. Casdell said she believed so. She said the animal was healthy, that the old injury had healed well, that the trauma of the fire and the sedation and the transport were stressors, but not permanent damage. She said she expected a full release within 6 weeks. Marin said she was glad. She said it the way you say things that are true, but that do not come close to containing what you mean. Marin sat with that for a long time. Casdell gave her space to sit with it. There was a version of this story in which the wolf had denned in that house because it was warm and dry and sheltered, and she had no reason not to. There was a version in which everything else was coincidence. An injured animal, a trapper who later became something worse, a woman alone on 40 acres who happened to be the thing standing between a land assembly and its completion. There was a version in which the wolf was just an animal responding to fire, and the cubs were just cubs, and none of it meant anything beyond the bare facts of what had happened. Marin had spent 8 years trying to live in versions. In the version where Cutler Briggs was just an interesting stranger she had met at an auction. In the version where the calls were just coincidence. In the version where the mark on the gate was nothing. She had not found any of those versions particularly livable. Casdell asked her if she was all right. Marin said she was going to be. The investigation moved quickly after that, partly because the boot print was a match to a pair of work boots recovered from the back of a truck, registered to a shell company that, when traced through 2 layers of incorporation, connected to a property development firm in Billings that had a financial relationship with a man named Stellan Holt, and partly because the cell tower data for that night put a phone registered in Briggs's name within 2 miles of the property at the time the fire started. What Marin did not know when she told the deputy about Cutler Briggs was that Briggs had not yet left the county. This was a fact that would seem, afterward, like an error in judgment so obvious that it begged explanation. The explanation, as best as investigators were able to reconstruct it, was that Briggs had driven to Sutter Creek Road with a specific timeline and a specific confidence, and the wolf had disrupted that timeline in a way that required him to wait and watch from a distance before he could assess what had happened. He had parked on a service road a mile from the property and had watched the fire trucks arrive and had understood, when the FWP vehicle arrived, that something had gone wrong with the version of events he had planned. He had needed to know how wrong. He had stayed. This is the thing that happens when a plan is constructed around the assumption that there will be no witnesses. And then there is a witness. The plan does not simply fail. It requires revision. And revision requires information. And information requires proximity to the thing that has gone sideways. He had been parked on that service road in a truck registered to the shell company for 2 hours when the FWP vehicle pulled away from the scene and took the service road toward the highway. He had pulled far enough to the shoulder that it could pass. The vehicle had slowed as it came alongside him. Inside the transport crate in the back, the wolf had been lying with her head on her paws. She had been sedated or partially sedated, a kind of chemical twilight that produces stillness without full unconsciousness. The FWP officer driving would say later that she had noticed the wolf's head lift as the vehicle came alongside the parked truck. She had said this in her statement, and then said that she did not know what to make of it, that she was not an expert in wolf behavior, that she was including it because she thought it was relevant and was comfortable letting someone else decide if it was. The wolf's head had come up. She had made no sound. The FWP vehicle had passed and continued to the highway. Briggs had not moved for 12 minutes. Then he had made a call to a number that would later appear in the phone records as one of 17 calls in a pattern that the investigator described as consistent with coordination of a paid contractor, and the call had lasted 4 minutes, and whatever was said in those 4 minutes had been enough for Briggs to decide to leave. He had driven south. He had made it 40 miles before. Deputy Cantrell's request for a cell tower ping on the number registered to Briggs had come back to dispatch. They had been able to intercept him before the county line. He had not resisted. He had sat in the back of the sheriff's vehicle on a November morning with the sky going gray over the Bertooth and said nothing, which was consistent with what everyone who knew him had always said about him, that he was a man who understood when talking made things worse. He sat with that understanding all the way to Stillwater County. Briggs was arrested 17 days after the fire in a motel outside of Laurel, still in Stillwater County, as if he had not been able to make himself leave. Holt was charged separately, 6 weeks later, with solicitation and conspiracy. Both of them hired expensive lawyers. Neither of them posted bail immediately. Marin was not there for either arrest. She had stopped wanting to witness things that she could not change, and that arrest was not the same as an ending. The Cubs spent 9 weeks at the rehabilitation facility in Livingston. This is longer than it sounds when you are the person waiting. Marin drove to Livingston 4 times during those weeks. She was not permitted to handle the Cubs because the goal was release and not habituation to humans, and the staff were careful about this in a way that she respected. But on her 3rd visit, a technician named Bridger walked her to a window that looked into the outdoor enclosure, and they stood there together and watched the Cubs, who were now large enough to stumble at speed and who spent most of their time investigating the fence line with a thoroughness that the staff said was a good sign. She could not tell which one had been the still one on the tarp. She told herself that was all right. The wolf, their mother, had been released 6 weeks after her initial transport. A scar on her leg was documented. Her GPS collar data was filed with FWP. She went east first, then circled back toward the Bertooth, tracking a path that the biologist said was unusual, but not inexplicable. A route that covered territory she appeared to know. She did not return to Sutter Creek Road. There was nothing there to return to. The trial dates were set and moved, and set again in the way of legal proceedings that involve more than one defendant and more than one jurisdiction, and Marin stopped tracking them closely because tracking them required giving Cutler Briggs a portion of her daily attention that she had decided he did not deserve. Her attorney kept her informed. Her attorney was a woman in Billings named Cress, who had a reputation for patience and a voice like a road sign, clear and unambiguous, and who had told Marin in their first meeting that the case was solid and that patience was her job and she should let her do it. Marin had found this the most useful thing anyone said to her during the entire period. She did not want to talk about it. People, when they learned about it, wanted to talk about it, wanted to walk through the story, wanted to get to the part about the wolf, because the wolf was the part that made sense emotionally. That gave the story a shape you could hold, and she understood this. But she was also aware that the story was not the wolf's story. The wolf had done what she had done because her cubs were there. That was the whole of it. The rest was the story of a woman who had been afraid for 8 years, and had been right to be afraid, and had still not been frightened enough. That was the part she was still working through. The wood shop helped. She was making a dining table in October, a commission from a family in Billings, solid ash with legs she had turned herself. The work required sustained attention of a kind that did not leave room for anything else, and that was the best thing about it, had always been the best thing about it, from the first time she had stood at a lathe 8 years ago and understood that the present tense, when occupied fully enough, had no room for the past. Carol came out twice in the fall. They ate at the table that was still a sawhorse and board arrangement in the kitchen of the prefab, which was smaller and less interesting than what she had built before, but was warm and did not leak and had view of the paddock from the kitchen window that she liked. Carol had stopped having anxiety episodes, or was managing them better, and she and Marin had arrived slowly at the kind of friendship that did not require performance or explanation, that could sit in the same room for an hour without speaking and call it a good visit. That was the thing she had not expected when she had come to Sutter Creek Road with 2 suitcases and the specific intention of being left alone. She had expected solitude. She had not expected that solitude and friendship could coexist without canceling each other out. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about a few things. The trial was set for February. Her attorney said it would likely conclude quickly, given the evidence. She said probably. Marin said she would be there. She was. Marin received the insurance settlement in the spring. It was enough to rebuild, or enough to go somewhere else, or enough to split the difference and do something she had not planned. She was still deciding in March. She was still deciding in April. In May, she drove out to the property and stood in the field where the house had been and looked at the foundation, which was all that was left, stone and concrete and the ghost of a floor plan, and tried to figure out what she wanted. She had rebuilt her life before on the proceeds of an ending. She knew how to do this. She was not afraid of the work. What she was afraid of, if she was being honest, was the version of herself that had spent 8 years managing her fear quietly and calling it independence. The version that had seen the tire tracks and taken a photograph and told no one. The version that had recognized the mark on the gate and locked the door and waited. She was not sure that version of herself had served her as well as she had needed it to. In June, the cubs were released. She was not there for the release, because the rehabilitation staff preferred that no one be there except their team, for the same reasons they had asked her not to handle the cubs. But Bridger sent her a photograph afterward, taken from a distance with a long lens of 3 shapes at the edge of a tree line somewhere in the Burtooth corridor. 2 of them were looking back toward the camera. One was already walking into the trees. Marin looked at that photograph for a long time. There is a thing that happens when you have been afraid for a long time, and the thing you were afraid of has been removed. And the thing is that the absence of fear is not automatically filled with anything else. It is just absence, which has its own weight, its own sound, its own specific quality of morning light coming through a motel window onto a table where you have your coffee. She began building again in August, not on the same foundation. The insurance adjuster had told her that was possible, but she had looked at that foundation in May and understood that she did not want to live on it. She had the old structure demolished and the stone cleared, and she bought a modest prefabricated structure that she knew she could modify over the years into something that fit her, the way you modify anything that starts as a skeleton and becomes a life. The horses were in the paddock by September. The wood shop was running by October. The garden was a plan for the following spring. She was, by November, a woman who had rebuilt a life that was approximately the same as the one she had built before. with the difference that she was not afraid, not less afraid, not managing the fear. Not afraid. She did not see the wolf again. She had printed the photograph and put it on the wall of the wood shop above the lathe, which was where she put things she wanted to see every day without making a ceremony of it. The photograph was small and slightly blurred at the edges because of the distance it had been taken from, and the three shapes at the tree line were not entirely distinguishable from each other. But she knew they were there, and she knew what they were, and that was enough. A Beartooth corridor in that photograph was an early summer light, that specific June quality of light that hit the high Montana meadows in a way that turned the grass almost luminous. And the tree line was Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, dark and close grown, and the three shapes at the edge were moving from the open into the shade. One was already inside the trees. Two were still in the light. She looked at that photograph while she worked. She did not look at it the way you look at something you are trying to remember. She looked at it the way you look at something that has already been filed. That does not require active memory, because it is simply part of how you understand the shape of your own life now. Some things come to you because you built something they needed. Some things stay near you long enough to matter and then go where they need to go. Most of the time, you do not get to know which category you are in until it is already over. She turned the lathe on. A shop filled with the smell of ash being cut, which was her favorite wood to work with, which was a fact she had not consciously connected to anything until this moment, standing here, and then had connected, and had let the connection be what it was, without making it mean more than it meant. The work was good. The light outside the shop window went flat and gray the way it did before snow. She worked until it was dark. She did not expect to. That was not how it worked, and she was a practical person who did not confuse what she hoped for with what she was owed. But in November, very early, before the winter had settled fully over the Beartooth, and the light had gone flat and gray the way it does, she was in her woodshop late in the afternoon, and she heard the horses shift in the paddock, that particular restlessness they had when something moved in the tree line, and she went to the shop window and looked out. She did not see anything. The horses settled. The tree line was still. She stood at the window for a long time anyway, and the way that people stand at windows when they are listening for something they cannot hear, feeling for something that may not be there, holding open a question that may never be answered. The light went. She stood at that window for 11 minutes. She had not counted them, but afterward, thinking about it, she estimated 11. Long enough for the horses to fully settle, long enough for the dark to complete itself, long enough for the cold to come through the glass in the way that glass in Montana lets cold through in November. Not a draft, just a presence, a reminder. She thought about what Castell had told her, about the range shift, about how animals that had been through trauma sometimes moved away from the territory they had known. She thought about how the wolf had built a den in a house that belonged to someone else, in a structure that was warm and dry and sheltered, in a corner that was as far from the wind as you could get, with no knowledge of property lines or ownership or the complications that human arrangements layer onto the simple question of where it is safe to rest. She had understood that when Castell told her. She had understood it from the inside. She turned the shop light off. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and while she waited for it, she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the paddock, where Roscoe was a dark shape near the fence, and Fleet was somewhere in the back, invisible in the November dark. They were fine. They were always fine. She checked on them the way she checked on things she loved, not because they needed checking, but because the checking was its own thing, its own small act of attention in the dark. The kettle began to sound. She made her tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the prefab that was smaller than what she had built before, and was hers in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, uncomplicated. She went back to work. The smallest of the three had opened its eyes for the first time on the tarp that morning in November, a year before. The wildlife technician who wrote the intake report had noted it. The cub had looked directly at the firefighter kneeling over it, and had made no sound at all.